there's just a lot of just quiet grumbling about GraphQL in the community at large. It's just like, dude, our GraphQL API is unmaintainable. We're actually rewriting everything in LiveView, but it seems like it just turns into this just big hairy monster. Welcome to another edition of Software Sophistication, the Q&A show where we talk about Elixir, Phoenix LiveView, and all things software development. Today we have a mega question from Arpan, so this is the second version of our initial episode. We're going to be answering 3 more questions from Arpan today. He left a comment for us in the YouTube comment section, and he's asking about all things LiveView architecture. So once again, we have Micah back with us, resident, at least Jacksonville Elixir architect. So I don't know if there are others out there, but this is my favorite and the guy that I would go to. So he's our special guest again, my longtime mentor, and someone that I consider a friend, even though we don't see each other very often. So Micah's here today, and he's an architect at F5 Networks, which is a startup doing interesting things. Micah, welcome to the show. Tell us about F5 Networks and a little bit about your career.
Yeah, so I work for F5 Networks, kind of like the big company that everybody uses and no one's ever heard of. They make the box, which is pretty much in every data center in America. And in recent years, they've made a lot of software acquisitions, including Nginx, which is probably something you've heard of or used. And so they also have some new and interesting things. And I'm part of a small group right now. They're just kind of getting our footing, and we're kind of doing some incubation project type stuff, which means we're like an internal project, but we kind of get our own funding in our own direction. So we're really being kind of ran like a startup, which is nice,
yeah,
but we
cool.
have big enterprise funding, so
There we go.
that's cool too. But yeah, we're about 5 people right now, so really I'm an architect just in in name, not really in practice, but hopefully soon we'll have a much bigger team. And kind of what we're doing right now with Elixir is we're building out some like easy button access to F5 Cloud, which is kind of like what they call distributed Kubernetes, which is basically allowing you to have multi-cloud Kubernetes clusters across, AWS or what, and even in your own data centers, right? So you can have like, here's my data center plus Google plus AWS, and have all that traffic kind of route to where it needs to be and be able to manage deployments and stuff through there. So
that's really
pretty
cool
interesting stuff.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, what got you interested in Elixir? I was actually looking at your article way back from 2016 earlier today, which I will never forget. The name was a great name, which was state in a stateless language, or making state in a stateless language. You were talking about Elixir 6, 7, 8 years ago. So what has kept you so interested about the Elixir ecosystem?
Oh man, well, the majority of what I do day to day is I create applications that live on the internet. And because of that, I need to build software that doesn't fail. And Erlang is, that's the whole purpose of it. Is like the whole question was like, how do we build, high availability systems or software that when it encounters an error, it stays up. And I think that this kind of dynamic plays very well, especially in today's ecosystem where everything is a long-lived service online. Like, what happens when you encounter errors, and how do you handle those errors? And so I think the Erlang ecosystem really had an interesting take on that and kind of solved it. And if you really look at what Kubernetes is doing today, it's kind of almost the same thing where they're almost reinventing Erlang. They're just reinventing it
Sure,
in
okay.
VMs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's some other stuff too with networking and things that Erlang doesn't necessarily tackle, but the whole idea of like, if a system encounters a problem, just restart it. That's kind of like the idea, but in the software itself versus in the hardware or the virtualization layer, right? So I think that Elixir is a great pick for modern applications that have to have zero downtime. They have, I guess the term they use is soft real time, but really what that means is just you have something on the internet that needs to exchange some data, and it doesn't have to be like, like if I send you something, you have to respond within 1 millisecond. It's I send you something and you can respond back, when you're done processing it. Mm-hmm. And so for systems like that, this is incredible, right? Like it's exactly what you would want to build, I would think, is a system that doesn't fail. And then I think the more interesting piece is that's Erlang, but then Elixir adds on top of that this like beautiful like meta programming language on top of it, which makes it really nice to write DSLs and have I guess, easy buttons to get things done. So you've got kind of like the Ruby on Rails mentality of like you can drop something in and get it done easily. And then on top of that, you've got this language that once you kind of like realize at least for me, the realization of what functional programming gave me as far as having like a data-oriented view of my program versus an object-oriented view of my program, it allowed me just to pull a bunch of boilerplate code out. And so I tell people all the time, I can do pretty much anything in 100 lines of Elixir. It's not exactly true, but for the most part it is, right? Like if somebody says I need a feature and I'm in a Phoenix app or something, like it's, obviously if you need HTML or something, you're going to write a lot of HTML or whatever. But as far as actual Elixir code, generally speaking, 100 lines of Elixir is all you need.
Right.
So yeah, I think Elixir's a great language for getting things done. So it's just a great language to start with. You get to start with, I'm going to build something really quick and fast and get it to market. And then once it's there, I've got performance and stability, and I can keep iterating on that thing. And I feel like a lot of times people write things in like, Ruby on Rails or Python or whatever. Once they get to a certain scale, they have to figure out how to and I guess even with Erlang or Elixir, once you get to a certain scale, you have to figure out how to scale it, obviously. But I just feel like you get there much sooner. And so you end up with things like Twitter saying Rails doesn't scale and rewriting everything in Scala, or like these kind of crazy, like we've got to rewrite the universe because we've already written it one way, and the only way to make it faster is obviously to rewrite it. But I just think it takes a lot longer to get there with Elixir, and maybe it never does, right? Like I don't know. I haven't gotten to that situation yet where performance is my problem, right? I have a application that I built that does analytics that handles over 4,000 requests per second. It's had like 2 downtimes in the last 2 years that were really configuration problems for external services and not the service itself.
Wow. And
like, how do you get better than that? And I can't answer that question because I don't know. Maybe one day I'll figure that out. But yeah, I think Elixir, Phoenix, and the whole ecosystem is just an amazing place to be. Wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
For sure. I mean, in my own experience of 3 years of doing Elixir nearly full time, I've had to think about performance on less than the times that I can count on one hand, like maybe 2 or 3 times. Like it's really just you do it and it kind of just works and it's fast and you move on. So yeah, Elixir's been amazing. Yeah, so amazing. All right, yeah, so let's move into Arpan's question about Phoenix LiveView architecture, which is he's going to be talking first about no JavaScript, which is, quote, although LiveView claims that we won't have to write any JavaScript, I often find myself writing LiveView JavaScript hooks to perform common tasks like infinite scroll, etc. This is fine, but I would love it if it was all Elixir because I guess that's not possible. Micah, what's your take on this?
Well, I mean, I guess one thing is that you have to consider is that at some point you're going to need to register some type of DOM event. There's going to be, I think one of the things he mentions here at some point is infinite scroll or whatever. So, at some point you have to be able to hook into, register, and listen to DOM events. That has to happen in the browser, which means at some level the way, it doesn't even mean, like we always interface with the browser through JavaScript. It's just how it's done. Maybe you could talk about WebAssembly or something, like that's coming along, but like today, pretty much the way you interface with the browsers through JavaScript. So I know there are some tools that will compile Elixir to JavaScript that have been around for a while, and maybe you could attempt or tackle something like that. But realistically, at the end of the day, if you're interfacing with a browser, even if you do it with Elixir, you're compiling to JavaScript. Right. And so I guess the idea is to try to figure out how to not do that. And that's a great question. Like, I don't know that we have an answer to that yet. Maybe it is something like compiling Elixir to JavaScript, or maybe it's just we accept that like there are some edge cases that we're going to have to hook into browser events, and maybe it's better to be closer to the metal, I guess, with JavaScript,
right?
And just hook into those events, send those events over a WebSocket, and then let the processing happen on the server side all in Elixir, right? So the amount of JavaScript that we're writing in Elixir should be, or with Phoenix LiveView, should be minimal. But if you're interfacing with a browser, it's just, it's the way it is right now. Maybe one day we'll see this WebAssembly world, and that won't be the way it is anymore. But the way it is today is we use JavaScript.
Yeah, so RPAN, in my own experience, when I've been doing Phoenix LiveView for about 3 years now, and it's very rare that I've had to reach out to JavaScript itself. I'm going to just shoot in the dark here. I think that what you probably should be looking to achieve is to use probably some sort of OTP abstraction, whether it be the agent. So I don't really know if that's the correct answer, but whenever I've really wanted to do something special in Phoenix LiveView, it always involved process communication, which is very simple to do. It's hard to understand initially, but very easy to actually implement process and OTP abstraction, communicating over between processes and stuff. Essentially all that to say, I think that you probably can get a lot of the things that you're trying to get done without JavaScript, sort of like what Micah was saying, and in my own experience, that has been the case. Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to conclude off of that, or
that's great.
Okay. All right, so this next one from RPAN regards the speed with which changes are coming to the LiveView ecosystem, which is, I see the LiveView team is doing amazing work adding new things like slots, the JavaScript module, etc. to LiveView. While this is all great, unfortunately it makes things difficult for people who are using LiveView in big production applications and want to stick to the latest standard. They may have to rewrite many parts of their LiveView code base to use the new things that are added. I prefer to use new frameworks when they reached a certain checkpoint in terms of stability, and I know the team won't be adding lots of new changes to the framework in every few months. Micah, what's your take?
Well, I'm kind of going to throw a little misdirection here, but my take is, have you tried using JavaScript, right? So, I used to joke with my team and say, when anybody would say, oh, let's write something in Node, I'd say, well, let's write it in Node if you want to rewrite it every 6 months. And I've seen this multiple times in my career. It's kind of a joke. It's not exactly true. It's maybe not every 6 months, but I've seen multiple times in my career where we were using some type of build system and a new version of it came out and it completely did away with the old build system and we needed some new feature or wasn't compatible with the new version of Node. And it ended up just being like rewriting the entire app, not even because we wanted to, but because we had to, because backwards compatibility was just cut from some framework, or there was something we were using that just disappeared off the face of the planet, like it was no longer maintained. The JavaScript community, once again, I'm derailing this, but like the JavaScript community is kind of still, very much in flux. Every 3 months there's a new framework, a new hotness, a new blazingly fast, and so it's just really hard to keep up in that ecosystem. So as fast as I feel like Elixir Phoenix LiveView is moving, I also feel like it's very slow and stable compared to the JavaScript ecosystem. I know that's kind of a maybe punting the answer or not really answering that question right, but it's in the grand scheme of things. Is it as stable as C where nothing's changed or changes very often? No, but it's still a new technology. There's going to be improvements. There's going to be changes, but I feel like even when there's a new thing that comes out and I have to make some changes, I've never felt like I've had to rewrite my app.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I feel the exact same. RPAN, you have 3 years of experience in Phoenix LiveView. It's so early. This is the price that we have to pay for being early adopters, but the reward we get on the other side is the fact that you, I, Micah are early experts in an ecosystem that is expanding, it's gaining mind share, and this is a feature, not a bug.
A lot of features.
So the next one is the mobile API integration and how that relates to LiveView. So I need a suggestion regarding this. Say we have a GraphQL API for mobile and a LiveView application for the web app. So there's 2 options. The LiveView can either call the context functions directly or use the GraphQL APIs using something like Absinthe. So Absinthe is the Elixir library for creating, I think that's correct, right, for creating GraphQL APIs. Mm-hmm. So that we have a single point of entry to the app. What do you think is the correct approach here? Is how to approach having a LiveView layer and a mobile app? Is that a good argument for not using LiveView, because should you just be building APIs? Like, do you say, is the productivity boost of just building an API worth not using LiveView?
Well, I think there's a third option here. It's kind of a new kid on the block, but it's something specifically with iOS apps, is something out there to at least investigate. And that is that Brian Cottarello announced at this year at ElixirConf that they have a new LiveView native thing. So it allows you to write iOS apps in LiveView and have your mobile device be delivered via LiveView. And so you say, okay, well, why would I want to write my LiveView twice? Because I've got to write my LiveView for my browser, and then I've got to write my LiveView for my iOS app. Like this is kind of painful or whatever. But my response to that is exactly what his question answers is like GraphQL, right? Like you can build this giant GraphQL API and have all the complexity of that, or you can just allow Phoenix to automatically do your diffing for you over the wire and send very small, efficient payloads of just what you need to update your UI. So I think that LiveView native...
You mean in terms of that's what LiveView does? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what LiveView does.
Right,
and then LiveView native adds to that, the fact that it can run natively on iOS.
Right.
So you get your native iOS, but you also get those small DOM diffs, and you don't have to write your GraphQL integration from your client, as well as you don't have to write your GraphQL backend to use.
Right.
So and so I think that really takes me into the next piece of this, and I know I told you for years, Josh, that like I thought that like one of the advantages of writing an SPA is that you got an API out of the box, and I said that for years. But at the time, I was working at Heroku building their APIs for their front end, and the APIs for the front end were not doing that. And let me explain why. So a lot of times when you have a public API, what you end up having is you end up having CRUD cycles, right? So you don't really know, when I say public API in this, I mean like for public consumption, not it's in the public domain, right?
Okay.
And so I have an API for public consumption. Well, I don't know what the client needs from my API. I can't predict that. I can guess, I guess, and throw stuff out there. But really, it comes down to I kind of, for every one of my actions, need to expose CRUD. I haven't, I don't know if their client's going to need to read or delete or what it's going to do. Right? So I need to expose those CRUD actions. But then what happens is that I end up writing a UI. Let's look at like the Heroku dashboard, for example. I end up writing a UI like the Heroku dashboard, and I display a bunch of apps, and then each one of those apps at the bottom corner has like a graph that displays like memory usage or network traffic or whatever, and it's on the page, right? And so that works great because it's N+1, right? So for every app, you have to also go fetch all those metrics data points so that you can display the graph. And so you got this N+1 scenario. It's actually probably N+3 or 5 or 7 because each one of those apps has to request a bunch of different things. Wow. And so what you get to is you get to this point where you're like, okay, well, that works for 3, 5 apps. But what happens when a customer has 1,000 apps or 10,000 apps? And no one builds applications for this, right? Like, oh, well, who would ever have 1,000 apps, right? And so, but you get to that point.
Wow, okay.
And so like, how do you then like manage that complexity? Well, then you have to add things like pagination, but even then, what if you paginate to like 100, 100's too much, do you paginate to 10? Like there's all these complexities there. So what you end up doing is that you end up building an API that's very specific to your UI, just for UI consumption.
Right.
And I've seen this at every big company I've ever been at. In the early days of programming your app, like you can get away with a lot. But when your app starts becoming really used and it has a lot of traffic, or like when you really start coming up against like the size of the data or the amount of data you're handling, you have to start thinking about things differently. And I have yet to see a one-size-fits-all API, and maybe somebody out there has it and they can explain it to me because I'd love it to know, but like I've yet to see one size fits all API that fits for their React, it fits for their
Isn't that the argument for GraphQL? That's the argument for GraphQL.
Well, this is an argument for GraphQL. I'll get there in just a second.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm very long-winded.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Okay.
So what ends up happening is you end up building an API that's separate for exactly what you said, for your UI. So the kind of idea that you're going to build one API and your SPA is going to consume it, it's really kind of a lie, right? Because really you need a separate API just for your SPA, single page application for those that React, whatever. So you end up writing 2 APIs anyways, unless you don't have a public API. Maybe you're building an API that's just for consumption by your UI because it's just really a web page and you just are over-architecting, right? You could have used LiveView. So, and then I guess the scenario to that is people say, well, what if my client could ask for exactly the data that it needed, and this would solve a lot of my problems because then each individual client could request the payload that it wants, and I could have one API that could serve all those needs. And I feel like this is this is interesting, and I think that this is the thing that GraphQL really tries to sell. But I think it's harder than what people give it credit for.
Okay.
And there's a lot of problems with GraphQL in the fact that you have to be able to like have associations, and like how do those associations work? And then once you get all those associations, how do you query them efficiently? How do you secure them? So like if I have like a blog post that has comments, and then I can get the blog post that those people or the people that comment on that, and then the blog post they belong to, and then the comments for those things, and you get like this really crazy graph of like requests, right? Mm-hmm. How do you paginate that? How do you secure that, right? Because you want to make sure that the person that's making the request doesn't get access to things that they shouldn't have access to through some weird query method.
Right.
And so it becomes really, really difficult to do GraphQL. I'm not saying that it's not possible. There are companies out there that like GitHub that have, of course, the GitHub hired like the people form GraphQL to do their GraphQL.
Okay, yeah.
So most people aren't that, right? That's the thing, is like most people aren't that. So looking at GitHub and saying, well, GitHub did it, it's like, yeah, well, if you had the core maintainers of like whatever language, you could probably do it too. But you probably don't, right? You probably have like a few developers that are kind of newer to the field, maybe one or two seniors, and like you're trying to figure it out because it's a new technology to you, and you're trying to understand the same things that those people understood, but you maybe have a different view of it or different ideas about it, and like it gets complicated. So I just don't know, at least from my perspective, I just don't know that GraphQL really solves the problems that it promises to solve in a way that's efficient and effective, right? Like just the typecasting of GraphQL is going to add massive amounts of overhead, right? So you ask your GraphQL server for something, it has to check the types of each one of those things.
Wow, okay.
Right? And so you think, okay, well that doesn't take a lot, but you're now adding time to every single request. And then you're aggregating multiple requests, because most of the time you're not just going to your database, you're maybe going to other like back-end things, you're trying to aggregate that data. All that stuff takes a lot of time. And so you end up with a very slow, very clunky API that has weird security problems and doesn't do pagination very good.
Yeah.
And it is what it is. So I don't want to just trash GraphQL. I'm sure somebody out there like GitHub is doing it great and perfect. I just don't know that it's for everybody. It's not for me, especially as easy as it is to just create something with LiveView and let it take care of diffing the data and sending it over the wire, and I don't have to think about it.
Awesome. Yeah, so I've people that I've maintained contact with in my programming network, there's just a lot of just quiet grumbling about GraphQL in the community at large. It's just like, dude, our GraphQL API is unmaintainable. We're actually rewriting everything in LiveView. It just seems to be, it turns into this monster. That's what I've heard. I've not done GraphQL myself in any significant way. I've played with it, but it seems like it just turns into this just big hairy monster. That's what I've been hearing.
Well, what they tell you is that it pushes the complexity away from the client and into the server, but I don't think that's true. I think what actually happens is that now you have to have like special frameworks to handle GraphQL, and like how do you do caching and all the things. So now you've pushed an extra layer of complexity into the client and an extra layer of complexity into the server.
Wow.
Right? I think that what's beautiful is JSON API, right? It's not really a toolkit. It's just a standard. The Ember community kind of like came up with it. It's not just for Ember. It's for everyone. But it really has a lot of like years and years of expertise where they've come to the conclusion of like, this is how you need to embed metadata in your JSON responses. This is how you need to include or sideload data that isn't necessarily in the main response.
Right.
This is how, like how you filter data. This is how you do pagination. And it's all laid out and it's very clear as a standard, and you kind of implement it yourself, but it implements over REST, which you can just curl, right? So it's really like a great standard, and it solves basically the same problems that GraphQL solves, but it solves them in a way that in my mind, you don't have like this whole extra layer of this special language that you're trying to query in and all the typing and all that. You're just talking REST.
Right.
I think if you're really interested in trying to figure out how to like load data, you should at least investigate, or like sideload data, or like have your clients ask for different payloads in different scenarios. You should really at least investigate JSON API.
Excellent.
It's a great standard.
I think we've taken a roundabout, we've walked around the question. I think we've answered a lot of tertiary questions, but But let's answer his question directly, which is about you have a LiveView app and you have a GraphQL app. And he talks about the context layer and a single point of entry to the app in regards to like at least it looks like having a GraphQL API and having a LiveView app. How do I make those, like what would be your suggestion for maintaining that in the most minimal way?
I would definitely think it would be a context, right? Like that's the whole.
And what is a context for those that may not know?
A context, I mean, if you really break down what a context is, it's like everything in Elixir. It's just a function, right? It doesn't mean anything. It's a context is a concept for humans. And so the idea of a context is I have this domain of, like authorization, for example, right? Like I have this domain of authorization. And it handles users, it knows about users, it maybe knows how to authorize whether I have access to an application or have access to, whatever. But really that domain there is authorization, right? And so that could be a context where you have it's just a module with a set of functions, and those functions that are performed on your authorization module are all in the context of the authorization and can authorize users or authorize users to use things or even maybe check in the database. I guess we're getting authentication authorization a little messed up.
Sure, okay.
But maybe even check in the database if the person's even logged in or not, right? So like you've got that concept, or you could have like the concept of like a blog, and a blog might have posts and a blog might have comments, but it all goes to the context of a blog. So you're like blog.give me all the posts for this user, or give me all the comments for this blog post,
right?
Or for the blog, give me all the comments for this post, right? And so the context there is like this conceptual idea for us as humans to help understand what we're doing. The nice thing about this is it gives us an interface or a pathway into our code that is all related to that single topic or idea, right? And so, and it's usually not built in our web folder in our Phoenix app. It's built in our just the kind of the vanilla lib folder of our Phoenix app. And the reason it's built like that is so that it can be reused in multiple ways.
Right.
A lot of times what I do is, like, for example, you might have the need to create a user. But creating a user might need to send an email with some type of like token validation. The person click a link to validate that their email's right. It might also need to send an email to notify like the owners or admins of whatever that this user signed up to their account. It might need to, if they're a new user, create like some kind of default settings for them, right? Like the whole idea, all the things that are involved in creating a user could go into this like, some type of context that is the creation of a user. And so now you have a single function that basically lays out all that kind of procedural, right? Very procedural data, right? Or flow. And so now if somebody that's like, I'm my system's having a problem or whatever, or I need to log into my IX console and I need to create a user, I'm not going and I'm manually adding a user to the database and then manually sending an email. I'm calling that function, and that function knows how to do all that work for me.
Right.
And so whenever I create a user, whether I'm doing that through my LiveView, whether I'm doing that from my API, whether I'm doing that from my iOS app or GraphQL or whatever, right? At the end of the day, I want to be calling that same function because that behavior should be the same in every scenario. So yeah, I think he's onto something. Like, you should probably be using context.
Excellent. Yeah, so there's your answer, Arpan. But in addition to that, we walked around the ecosystem at large, the JSON API specification, GraphQL, the merits of using GraphQL and why it was created in general, how they did it successfully at GitHub. But, we have these rumblings in the people that I know, and it's like, it's just painful. So, yeah, I think that this was a valuable discussion. And thank you, Micah, for your perspective. I think, yes, okay, so we have one more. We have one more, which is coming from Shannon, who is asking, great video, not much context there on LiveView or Phoenix in general, so it's really helpful to see you put it together for people just learning. One thing I'm still trying to figure out is how Phoenix plays well with the Ash framework. Apparently they go together really well, something called the staple stack. But basically there's zero documentation or examples of how to hook them up nicely. This sounds like a good idea for another video. I figured since we have Micah with us today, Micah, what is your opinion on the marriage of the LiveView stack and the Ash framework? What is the Ash framework, and what does it all mean?
Yeah, so Ash is a framework I've been wanting to play with. I think it's pretty neat as far as the documentation, because that's about how far I've gotten. I read the documentation and watched some videos online about using Ash. But the idea is that it's really kind of like framework agnostic. It's really about creating a resource, at least from my understanding, and then adding plugins to that resource. So you might create a resource that represents a user, but that really doesn't give you a whole lot. So then you might add a plugin for Postgres, for example. And then once you add the plugin for Postgres, it can automatically generate database migrations for you and generate ways to query that data. And then if you needed GraphQL, for example, or JSON API, as I talked about earlier, you could drop the JSON API plugin in, write a little bit of like declarative code describing what that endpoint should be like in that resource, what things should be exposed and how they relate to each other. And then it just magically makes everything happen and hooks it all up and wires it up, and even gives you some pretty interesting hooks or places you could hook into the life cycle of those things to do kind of custom auth.
Okay.
Now, in regards to LiveView and how that integrates, the real answer is I don't know, but they do have a pub sub library that I saw in the adapters section.
In Ash.
In Ash, yeah. And so the way I would probably approach this, at least from my very beginner, haven't really played with it mindset, is I would probably write my LiveView stuff and then hook in pub sub events to notify.
So what is PubSub for those that may not know?
It's publish and subscribe. So it's you should look at the Phoenix PubSub docs if you don't know what this is, but it allows you to have basically like a thing to subscribe to. Multiple things can subscribe to that, and then you can on that subscription you can publish or broadcast information. And the PubSub. Phoenix channels are built on top of PubSub, Phoenix PubSub, and then Phoenix LiveView is built on top of Phoenix channels.
Right.
So, it's kind of like the more primitive data type that you can work with here. But the real neat thing is that whenever you had changes in your database, like you did an update or a delete or create or something, you could hook into your PubSub there and broadcast those changes over channels and have other things subscribed to them, so you could have your UI like automatically update. For example, let's say you had like a chat bot, and for each item that somebody added to the chat, you could publish that there's here's the new thing, or broadcast it to the channel.
Right.
And you could have that wired up to where maybe whenever a record went in the database that was you were saving them off like as log lines or whatever. I don't know. That whenever it saved to the database, you could broadcast to say that there was a change or something, right?
Right.
So that's how I would approach hooking in and using to it. Maybe there's another plugin or something that I'm not aware of. I'm sure there's. It's kind of a newer framework, so I'm sure as the community grows, there'll be better and better stuff out there. But yeah.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like you have your Elixir code, and then surrounding that is your Ash framework, which kind of generates these. You can connect to Postgres, you can create GraphQL APIs. And then essentially LiveView sounds like it can, on top, access the Ash framework, which gives you access to everything else.
Well, the PubSub plugin can broadcast changes.
Okay, into Ash.
Through PubSub.
Yeah.
And then your LiveView can subscribe to want to be notified when those changes happen.
Right. Right.
So that's, I guess, you're saying the same thing. I think I'm saying it inverse.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Well, there we go. There we have it. Shannon, that's Micah's take, and I think that concludes our episode today. Micah, thank you for being on our show today, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure that the audience will too.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really an honor. So
yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right.